Okay, so what we're looking at right now is stage 3. So this is what stage 3 looks like, okay? So it's a bit of soft shadowing and the completed line work. So we're going to move into the next stage. And the next stage is all about, it's basically a continuation of stage 3 actually. But what we're doing is we're going to try and redraw some of the planes of the face so that we can separate the cast shadows from the shades, okay? So I want to explain to you what a cast shadow is compared to a shade. So a shade is basically where the form turns from light into dark, okay? So that transition on the side of the face there, that's a shade. A cast shadow is a shadow that's being cast from one object onto another. So you can see there's a slight cast shadow here being cast, which is being cast from the eye socket onto the face. You can see the cast shadow of the nose here onto the mouth. And there's also a cast shadow just on the chin, which comes from the bottom lip. And cast shadows should generally be drawn darker than the shades, okay? So you want the shades to be a step lighter than the cast shadows. So this stage is all about kind of just refining some of the planes, some of the construction, so that we can get a much more believable structure. And we also have to do that in the hair as well. Another thing that we have to pay attention to is the reflected light. So reflected light, if you have a look at the side of the face, all of this is shade, and then if you have a look at the jawline, it's a step lighter. And that's basically what's happening is reflected light is coming from the light source, it's bouncing off another surface, and then it's hitting the underside of the jaw there. So it gets darker up here, and then it gradually gets lighter along the bottom of the jawline. So all the surfaces that are facing downwards, they get hit by reflected light. Same with the bottom of the nose, that's going to be drawn quite light. Same with that part of the eye socket right there where it curves into the top eyelid. That's going to have reflected light. So this is where your understanding of form, anatomy, and structure really comes into play. And you're going to have to know that, especially when you're doing the hair curls as well, which we've kind of done already. You can see that this top part of the curl is a bit darker, and then there's some reflected light running along the hair strand there. So one more thing I want to talk about before we actually do start drawing this, because this is probably the most important part of all, is aerial perspective, okay? So what is that? Aerial perspective is basically how tones are affected by distance, okay? So when it comes to shadows, shadows are much stronger in the foreground, and then they tend to fade off in the background, which is kind of what I've done here. You can see this part of the head is closest to the viewer. So I've really strengthened these tones, like they're a bit darker, and then everything that kind of turns away from the viewer, like the neck travels away, that part of the hair travels away, all of those tones are rendered lighter. Okay, so shadows tend to fade into the distance. And so it's really important that we understand that, because as we start going into more and more detail on this drawing, we're going to have to keep that effect happening all throughout the drawing, okay? We don't want to render things completely equal. The effect of aerial perspective is not obvious in our reference. So this is actually more of a simulated effect that we do in the drawing. But if you can do it well, you're going to get a very good result out of it. And it's just going to make the drawing look a bit more three-dimensional. I'm going to edit this video so that I can show you an example of the aerial perspective. Okay, so jumping in now, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the easy part. I'm going to start with the cast shadow of the nose. So what we're going to do, just using a sharp pencil, you're just going to shade into that cast shadow. I'm just going to switch pencils here. Just lightly hatching that. And the nostril as well. So So I want that cast shadow to be noticeably darker than this part of the nose here. Just going to do some light hatching strokes on that part there. That plane of the mouth is actually facing downwards, so it actually gets a little bit of reflected light. So we actually leave that a little bit on the lighter side. So I'm going to darken the top edge of the brow line, and then that will gradually get lighter. You can see as that form curls in, that's where the reflected light is going to hit right there. So that part gets lighter. Now if you have a look at the reference around the eye, if you have a look at this part of the eye, there's a bit of a dark patch. So that's a plane change in there. You can see that's where the eye sort of inserts into the side of the nose. There's a bit of a shape. You can construct that shape like so. So you need to have a bit of a keen eye for this part of the drawing. But as long as your line work is looking good, and you're keeping on top of all of the proportions, you'll be able to see it a lot more clearly in your own drawing. So I'm just going to use some light hatching strokes just on the edge of the shadow there. Strengthen this part since that begins to turn into a cast shadow. So the brow is casting a shadow on the inside of the eye here. And it shouldn't really take you too much time to do the face since there's actually not that much detail here. Most of your time is probably going to be spent in the hair since that's where all the detail is. So I'm just darkening that cast shadow from the eyelid onto the eyeball itself. Just going to darken the edge of that. So a little bit of shadowing going on along the border here. There's a cast shadow in there as well. So just really soft, light hatching strokes on the side of the face. Don't get carried away with this part. A couple of strokes is all it really takes to make something a bit darker. So don't get too carried away with that soft transition of tone. You really want that to be a little bit on the lighter side. We can build it up throughout the course of the drawing, but for now, let's just keep that part nice and light. And this is a cast shadow from the head onto the neck. But again, because it's traveling from the center of the image, we have to render this a lot lighter. So this is where the drawing gets a little bit trickier because there's a few things to juggle around here. I'm just going to use single hatching strokes on the side of the face that cuts through the side of the face and the jawline. So all of those strokes continue down here. Okay, so let's actually have a look at the hair now. So as always, I'm going to strengthen all of the tones in the center of the image first, and then I'll gradually work my way out. And that way I've got far more control of the actual drawing. But in this stage, I really want to start paying much more careful attention to the forms of those hair strands. So earlier on in the drawing, we were kind of just carefully, well, not so carefully, but we were just, sketching everything in fairly quickly. But now that we've got the form in place, we really want to try and preserve that. You can see that I'm kind of re-strengthening some of my line work in the hair, in this area around here. So just sort of discovering new forms. If you see any cast shadows in the hair, make sure you separate them from the shades, which I know is a little bit trickier to do because it's there's a lot of detail in all of those forms, but it's all about just kind of training your eye to locate them. And even just sort of make them up as well, if you have to. You don't have to be a slave to the reference. Okay, so at this point, I think what I want to do is I want to show you a really neat trick. Let's say if you're losing control of the aerial perspective and things are getting too dark here, or everything just looks a bit too even, what you can do is you can come through with some large hatching strokes up near the border, and then darken those strokes towards the center, and then kind of relighten them along the edges. And that's like a really quick way, and you can just cut across the entire drawing like that. It's not going to affect the drawing too much. But that's a really neat way of just kind of re-establishing the aerial perspective, especially when you do it enough times. So yeah, this is the really time consuming part now, which is like building up the tones basically. Which probably isn't the most exciting thing to watch, but if I record myself doing it, then you'll know exactly how I'm doing it. You can see that I'm not hatching in the same direction all the time. I'm kind of hatching in the direction that kind of feels right to me. Generally, I typically just go with these sort of diagonal strokes, since that's like the most natural movement for my arm. But these strokes are just layered on, and they're almost invisible. And the reason you have to put them in lightly is because you don't want to bury the line work completely, especially this early on in the drawing stage. You really want to keep that line work visible at all times so that you can have much more control over the drawing. Anyway, that's basically the process. It's just layering on hatching strokes. So I'm going to stop recording here for a sec because this process is pretty much the same. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of refine the face a bit more. And then I'll come around into the hair a little bit more around the back here. Start drawing in some of those details. And then I'll get back to recording when I get closer to the final stages. Okay, so we're continuing on. Still detailing a lot of the hair strands in this area. So what I kind of want you to do is I kind of want you to go over some of the line work and just bring out some of those shapes a little bit more. You're going to need a sharp pencil to do this. And you're just highlighting some of those creases and folds in those hair strands. You can even do that in the areas back here where the forms are a little bit more subtle. So you see how I'm kind of outlining that reflected light on the edge there. And I've even done a little bit at the back of the hair bun around here. Just kind of coming in. And the reason we're doing this is because the line work actually helps to construct these forms, okay? It actually helps us to make sense of what these forms are doing, how they're curling, how they're turning. So it's a little bit of a back and forth. It's a little bit of hatching and then a little bit of refining the line work as you go. So now I'm just going to start hatching in some of that aerial perspective again. So that's something I like to come back to, like after I've done a little bit of detailing, I like to just kind of go over all of the tones in general and just kind of unify them. So darker in this region here, and then lighter on the edges. Okay, so let's have a look at the ear. Since the ear of the model has been a little bit neglected by this point, so I'm just going to kind of come in, start toning a few things. Okay, so as the drawing is progressing, you can see how I'm still trying to maintain that effect of aerial perspective. So there's a lot more contrast in the tones in the foreground here, and everything just kind of gets less contrasted as it moves away from the face. Okay, so that's the effect that you really want to try to maintain as you're toning the drawing in. And if you feel like everything, if you're not doing a good job of maintaining it, or if everything's looking a bit too even, just remember, you can always just hatch through all of those shapes with like a 6B pencil or something like that. Hatch through the center of the drawing and then gradually go lighter as you go to the edges of the drawing, okay? That's a really easy way of re-establishing that aerial perspective in the figure. You still have to do it kind of lightly, but you can build up those tones over time just to kind of re-establish that aerial perspective. And then as you're coming in and you're doing the hair, just make sure that you're outlining some of those plane changes. See how that strand tucks into there. See like these dark niches in the corners. Just with a dark pencil, kind of go over the line work. And just make sure that that line is still coming through the drawing, because that's how you can strengthen some of those really dark accents. So if anything's kind of looking a bit soft and fuzzy, just go over it again and just kind of outline everything. Just, you know, like the reflected lights, the dark shadows, just everything. Just kind of re-establish those through the lines, and then you'll start to notice that your shapes and the shadows are going to look a lot cleaner. So this is kind of like the opposite of the Barg method, where, you know, the Barg plates always encourage you to soften all of your tones and kind of blend them in all together, especially in the shadow shapes. But this is the opposite. This is kind of like really defining that structure in the drawing. And it's quite tricky to master, but with enough practice you can get very good at it. And then so from here, all you have to do is just continue to strengthen those tones, and that's really it. So you'll want to eventually start going into the light shapes. We spent a lot of time in the shadows, but eventually you're going to want to come in here and start shading in some of those halftones in the lights. So to do that, you're going to need a lighter pencil like an HB or You know, I wouldn't go any darker than a 2B pencil to do those. But you know, the process is the same. You're just using very light hatching strokes to do that. So I'll demonstrate how to do that in the next video. But in this stage, just focus on getting those shadow shapes to pop a little bit more. You know, don't try to rush through the stage, you know, because the shadows really do reveal the form a lot, I find. So if you can get those to look really good, then the rest of the drawing is going to be a lot more manageable.